Just, good morning. I'm Doug Futuyma, and this interview is taking place at Stony Brook University on August 12th of 2013 because I was having so much fun during the OTS ATVC celebration in San Jose that I totally forgot my interview time. So I'm trying to make up for it now, and I hope I don't make up for it at too great length. So I'm going to talk about my experience of the early experiences with OTS in Costa Rica, and I want to start actually with a little bit of personal background that I think is relevant. I became a naturalist because I grew up in New York City, in the Bronx, and that sounds incongruous to some people, but the fact is that what that meant was that from about 6th grade on, I spent countless hours at the Bronx Zoo, which had by far the largest collection of vertebrate species of any zoo in the United States, continually being added to and renewed. So I essentially started familiarizing myself with the world diversity of mammals, birds, and herps from the age of, I guess, about 10 on. And then starting at the age of about 12, I became quite an avid birder, or bird watcher, in the parks of New York, which are plentiful and offer a lot of bird life, especially during migrations. And so the result of this was that I became completely enchanted with biological diversity, especially of animals. Also started learning something about plants as I was birding in the New York Botanical Garden. And so this reinforced my intention to become a biologist with an emphasis in animal diversity, and I was particularly enchanted by reptiles and amphibians at that time. I then went to Cornell as an undergraduate, which was probably the best university that a budding naturalist could go to. I had courses there in ornithology from Charles Sibley, ichthyology from Ed Rainey, mammalogy, entomology, including insect taxonomy from the renowned Bill Brown of character displacement fame, and then went to the University of Michigan for graduate school. And at that time, I entered in the fall of 1963, and at that time, a number of faculty in Michigan, especially in the Museum of Zoology on that campus, were among the people that were active in initiating OTS and getting OTS off the ground. One of them, I had every intention of becoming a herpetologist, and so I had an office space or desk space in the Museum of Zoology. And one of the two curators of herpetology there, Norman Hartwig, was among those who were instrumental in the founding of OTS. And he encouraged me, he urged me to take the OTS course that was to be offered in the summer of 1964. And I think this might have been the second OTS course, I'm not sure. And so I went off to Costa Rica with immense excitement because here for years I'd been seeing all these wonderful animals that came from tropical climes, including tropical America, and I was prepared to see, just countless colorful birds and big cats and large snakes and so forth. I thought that you nearly had to step out of doors in a tropical country and you'd be seeing this immense diversity of wildlife. Well, of course, that proved not quite to be the case. OTS was, and I should also, by the way, say that at this point, and for several years thereafter, OTS was very handsomely supported by NSF, to the point where we students not only had a free tuition and we were flown down, our travel was paid for. On top of that, our room and board was paid for, and we actually got a per diem for incidental expenses. So I went home with more money in my pocket than I'd had when I started. This is a far cry from what a student has to experience today in terms of trying to fund his or her participation in the course. And I should say that this was an NSF expenditure that has obviously paid off absolutely immensely, because the result of this really was the creation of ecological and evolutionary research in tropical America by U.S. biologists, and after that by Latin American biologists. So anyway, so we arrive in San Jose in June of 1964 to find, first of all, that we were lodged in a pension in San Jose, where the family also lived, and could be quite, especially the young children, could be rather noisy at times. Lodged in rooms that were windowless, just off the main atrium where we were served meals. I was lodged actually with two other students, one of whom was George Eichwart, who a student of Charles Michener. He became one of the authorities on the systematics of bees, a renowned faculty member in entomology at Cornell later in his career, where he inspired people by his course in insect morphology, of all things. I mean, he was that fantastic a teacher. Unfortunately died much too young. So on top of our cramped and dark lodging, we faced the fact that that summer Volcano was issuing ash, and San Jose was directly downwind of Irasu, and so every day the question was not how is the weather, but how much ash is falling today. You could sit down to a meal with clean plates, and by the end of the meal, you'd be able to wipe ash off your plate with your finger. Now, OTS, of course, at that point was just barely getting off the ground, so it didn't have field stations. It was just making do as best it could with finding places to take students to show them the outdoors. The fact is that most of that course took place in a classroom at the Universidad de Costa Rica in San Pedro, where we listened to lectures about what was known about the tropics, to which the answer was actually precious little. The course was directed by Jay Savage from the University of Southern California. Jay was absolutely wonderful, immensely enthusiastic, and really put his heart and soul into this enterprise. We had a number of other lecturers. I remember in particular Rafael Lucas Rodriguez from the Universidad de Costa Rica giving these wonderful lectures about the history and culture of Costa Rica, which was very enriching for those of us like myself who had never been outside the U.S. before. Other lecturers included Charles Michener from Kansas, the great authority on bees, Nelson Harston from the University of Michigan, a renowned ecologist, and I'm sorry to say I'm not sure, I can't remember who else. But the result of this was that we spent most of the summer sitting in classrooms, listening to talks about what little was known about ecology of tropical systems at a time when most of the research that was being done in tropical America was by North American biologists, mostly systematists, taxonomists, who would go down to tropical American countries, collect specimens, bring them back to their institutions, and describe species and revise genera and so forth. I mean, absolutely essential work for establishing the taxonomic foundation of all ecological, evolutionary, and other biological research, but nevertheless extremely restricted. There was very little ecological work going on at that time. And of course, one of the raison d'etre of OTS was to encourage the development of such research. And so we would take short one-day excursions, and I started thinking that this was going to be a course about learning the names of roadside plants like Heliconia and Cecropia. There were occasional excursions that would be out for maybe 2 or at most 3 nights to places like the Cerro de la Muerte, in some place, I'm not sure what the institute was, at Guapiles, and a few other places. But by and large, I have to say, it was a disappointing summer. We students took it on ourselves on weekends when we didn't have to go out and listen to lectures at UCR. We took it on ourselves to do our own field trips, and we look at a map of Costa Rica and say, okay, let's try to go here or let's try to go there. And one such excursion was by the narrow gauge railroad across the country to the Atlantic coast in Limon, where we engaged a man with a boat to take us down to Calvita so we could see the coral reef there. And we never did see the coral reef because he ran out of fuel halfway down, had to paddle into a beach. We all got thoroughly drenched in disembarking, and it wasn't for quite some hours later that we were rescued and taken back to Limon, where we spent overnight in wet clothes and flew back to San Jose the next day. But we did take a few other excursions as well. I remember going to Puerto Viejo de Sarapiquí by bus. This was before the establishment of La Selva. And finding a little forested woodlot that was all the forest I could find, where I caught small frogs, Eleutherodactylus bransfordi, and recorded their color patterns because it was highly variable in color pattern. And that was my project. We were all supposed to do some kind of a project and write a short paper for the course. Well, so that was what an OTS course was like in 1964. And needless to say, I learned rather little in the way of personal experience. 2 years later, I must have been March or I think it was April of 1966, I was approached by 2 University of Michigan faculty members, Emmett Hooper, the mammalogist, and Arnold Kluge, herpetologist, who told me that OTS was in a situation where they needed to mount a second course, the so-called fundamentals course, would consist this summer not just of the one section, but of another section that they had to develop, because there hadn't been quite enough students to fill a projected course in vertebrate zoology, tropical vertebrates. And so they're mounting a second course instead, and at this late hour, they needed to staff it. And would I consider being a full-time instructor in this course? And I think they approached me about this because by that time they knew that I'd had all this background that I described earlier in vertebrate diversity. And I thought of myself as a vertebrate zoologist. I was still interested in herps at that time, and of course birds and everything else. And they thought that I knew enough to be able to actually act as an instructor, as here I was as a third-year graduate student, being asked to be a full-time teacher. And of course I said yes, and of course I had no idea at all what I was going to do. But I understood that by that time, the courses had a certain structure. And this was the structure that Dan Jansen had established between the time that I took my course and 1966. And this was this marvelous structure of field orientation walks, field problems, independent student projects, and lectures, resulting, of course, in very long days and very, very little sleep. This was my real introduction to Costa Rica, to the mature OTS, so to speak, and to the tropical ecosystems and the tropical diversity that I had longed to see, but really hadn't quite seen before. And so I was as wildly enthusiastic during this course as any of the students, because I was really seeing so much of this for the first time. And so we went, at this point now, having a number of places set up to actually, basically having field stations or the equivalent. And so we went, for example, spent a number of days at Finca La Pacifica in Guanacaste. We went to what would eventually become the La Selva Field Station, which at that time was operated by the Tropical Science Center. We spent several cold nights and days at Cerro de la Muerte and a few other places. This was just an absolutely marvelous experience all around. The students in the course included people who would go on to be very well known, such as Rob Colwell, Larry Gilbert at the University of Texas, really expert in, but was already an expert in butterflies, and he was just beginning graduate school at that time. Steve Arnold was again just starting graduate school at the University of Michigan. He took this course in the summer after his undergraduate work. Bob Jean, who went on to become a very well-known figure in the biology and systematics of social insects. Steve Tilley, expert on salamanders and speciation in salamanders. And this absolutely marvelous experience. I guess the one site that I forgot to mention was the site on the Osa Peninsula at Rincon de Osa, which was right at the edge of the vast untracked forest, much of which would then later become the Corcovado National Park. All of this was absolutely stunning. It shames me to think back on the attitude that we students brought to this, well, I was still a student, that we brought to this experience. Because remember, as I said, that before this time, most biologists who were going to tropical America were systematists, and they went there to collect specimens. And that was the mindset of many of us. And secondly, it simply never crossed our mind that tropical systems were going to be seen as threatened, as that tropical species would be seen as, as vulnerable. We, I think like everyone else at the time, thought of tropical regions as being these vast wildernesses, full of diversity, just overflowing with life. And so it didn't cross, the idea of collecting specimens or just killing things, just for the sake of looking at them closely, was something that no one gave a second thought to. Yeah, of course, why not? And I will never forget, because I have a photograph of it in my slide collection, I think the most shameful of these was one night, some students were out driving around. There was this was at Rincon de Osa, at the edge of this great wilderness, and they came across a bushmaster on the road. And so that they could show it to everyone, they shot it. I mean, that would be absolutely unthinkable today. But that was the tenor of the times. So it really says a lot about how perceptions and reality, but perceptions especially, have changed since the 1960s. This was an experience in which, of course, I had, having been notified that I would be teaching in this, I then had about 2 months in which to do an enormous amount of background reading and trying to familiarize myself as best I could with the herps of Costa Rica through the taxonomic publications of the time, reviewing what literature there was on birds. This was before Stiles and Scutch had their field guide to the birds of Costa Rica, because Gary Stiles was a student at that time. And went down there, first of all, with a whole set of lectures that were, all about basically what I was being taught at Michigan in ecology. And this was very much the heyday of sort of MacArthurian ecology, of this immense optimism about being able to explain ecological patterns from a theoretical population dynamic and community assembly point of view. And I gave lectures about that, and lecture about why there are more species in tropical regions than temperate regions. All of it cast very much in terms of the ecology of the day, and this, of course, would continue throughout the 60s and into the 70s. Would be that particular perspective. And I had to dream up field problems. Mind you, having seen most of these organisms or systems, having not seen them before or seen them very, very superficially. These included a few things that I think were interesting. I had one project one field problem in which students looked at Hoffman's woodpecker, a very common woodpecker in Guanacaste, to see if there was any difference between the sexes in their foraging behavior. because there had been published a paper by Bob C. Lander about woodpecker sexual dimorphism on islands compared to continents. In desperation, I dreamed up the idea of taking quadrat samples in the forest and searching through them with a fine-tooth comb to count frogs and lizards and any other herps we might find. The result of this was actually astonishing, because I really didn't think we would find very many, and instead we came up with very appreciable numbers of small lizards and frogs. And this was the beginning then of the litter herp field problem that I repeated in subsequent years when I taught in OTS, and that in particular Norm Scott picked up on, having been equally surprised by the fact that you could actually get reasonable numbers of animals. And he did this year after year in the many courses that he taught, to the point where over the years there accumulated a fair amount of reasonably significant data on the abundance and diversity of herps in different kinds of habitats, such as relatively mature forest compared to recovering second growth at La Selva. Around the same time, incidentally, unknown to me, Robert Enger at the Chicago Field Museum had published on a similar project in Borneo. And this turned out then to be some interesting ecological project. Well, that I think is what I have to say about the 1966 course. It was as I say, in the format that Dan Jansen had established, and which I hope continues to this day. Highly rigorous, utterly exhausting, utterly exhilarating, and really introducing students to both to the diversity of living organisms. We expected students to learn some of the common plants and major groups of insects, and at least some of the common birds and so on, and exposure to ideas, to concepts, and especially to looking at nature and trying to think of questions and how you would go about testing hypotheses and how you would go about analyzing data. And an approach that has certainly paid enormous dividends. Well, after 1966, since then I've been involved either as part-time or full-time instructor in I think 12 other OTS courses over the years, up until the early 1990s rather. Among these I co-coordinated two. In 1971, Rob Caldwell and I co-coordinated a course, and that was a marvelous course, again with some marvelous students. Jack Schultz was one of them, has gone on to be a major figure in the ecology of insect-plant interactions, especially chemical ecology. Jim Collins, who went on to become, among other things, a dean at Arizona State University and a program director at NSF. Peter Feinsinger, who did a lot of really important work on the ecology of hummingbirds and hummingbird communities. We had terrific resource personnel. Gary Hartshorn, who was working at La Selva at that time, did a terrific field problem. Al Bennett came down and gave some really excellent field problems in physiological ecology. Jim Hunt on social insects. This is a course in which we spent quite a bit of time at Finca Taboga, which was a governmental agricultural research station. And I remember that vividly for several experiences, one of which was walking on the floodplain of the river, where you had isolated clumps of vegetation around the base of trees in the area that was flooded during high water. Coming close to one of these clumps, hearing a buzz that I immediately recognized as being a rattlesnake, and immediately, apparently, I had no idea of such reflexes, located its direction, jumped backwards, and then looked to see a Crotalus durissus, the tropical rattlesnake, about 5 feet long, in full striking posture. That was quite an experience. I actually then went on to capture it in my insect net, and we brought it back to San Jose to the serpentarium where they extracted venom from snakes to make antivenoms with. This was incidentally a course in which we gave a final exam, and at these time in these years we gave exams in these courses, and you might be interested in some of the questions we posed on the final exam that students could choose from. Here's one. Account for the outlandish coloration of many tropical birds and reef fishes. Now there's a research program for you. Given 10 years and $500,000, that would be a huge amount of money. Outline research to answer questions of social importance in tropical America. Discuss the niche concept as it applies to plants. I think actually that's still worth doing. What are the selected advantages of narrower niches in stable environments? There was a question. I mean, there was the concept of how you account for tropical diversity at the time was that the tropics are stable and so species can become more specialized. Well, I'm not so sure that we think that anymore. Well, these are the sorts of questions that we tried to talk about during the course. This also, incidentally, the 71 course was a course that went down in history for being scandalous. At Rincon de Osa, at the field station there, we had experienced a series of really dry, really hot days, and then it rained, poured rain. And one of the women in the course, being that this is now, mind you, coming just out of the 1960s, one of the women basically took a topless shower in the water coming down off the roof of the building, and was seen by several of the Costa Rican help who were absolutely scandalized. And let me tell you, we heard about that. That I think had repercussions for subsequent courses. Well, just a couple of other things. One other course I did was the 1974 course that was coordinated by Ron Carroll. Other full-time instructors were Dave Janos, from now at University of Miami, Douglas Boucher, John Vandermeer. Again, a terrific group of students, Marty Condon, who's been doing some really neat work on fruit flies that that develop in tropical cucurbit flowers. Hank Howe, Marlene Palmer, a major figure now, Richard Premack, who's been doing all this really neat work on how floras have changed in Massachusetts since the time of Thoreau. Victoria Sork, dean and major ecologist at UCLA. Also remember this as being a trip in which we took a boat from La Selva downriver to Tortuguero, arriving there long after dark in what was at once boring and at the same time rather adventurous kind of experience. These were the days, of course, in which everything was done on paper with mimeograph machines. I think this was even pre-Xerox. And you had things like you had course books. I don't know if the courses still have books like this, but here is this thick book. This is the book that was issued and sent to every student, every participant at the end of the course. This is the 74-1 tropical biology course with a full description of all of the field problems that we instructors wrote up beforehand and distributed to the students. We usually wrote them up before coming down to Costa Rica so that we would have it'd be easier to copy them. As well as then the write-ups that the students wrote at the end of a single field problem, and it had the individual research projects and all sorts of other things in these books. And these books are really treasures. At least at this point for me, these are treasured as mementos of these courses. And again, at this time, any information that was being gathered was new or useful. Just being able to identify any tropical organism was very often a challenge. And so you had people in OTS putting together things like this handbook for tropical biology in Costa Rica, this is from what year? Not sure what year, but I think it's the early 70s or so. And this is summaries of, 1971, about the climate of Costa Rica, about substrate, about vegetation, about numbers and distribution of taxa of various kinds, such as ants and bivalves and mammals, species diversity patterns, trends in competition, patterns of heterogeneity, keys to many groups of organisms, the orders of insects, the major families of plants, and so on. And this is the way in which this precious information was being compiled and made available in those days for students to use during the course. I mean, we carried with us large boxes the size of this table, in which was stuffed full of books like this. All the resources that we might need for being able to identify the organisms that people were doing projects on. Well, I think I've gone on more than long enough. It has been for me a really rich experience being able to go to Costa Rica over the years, as I say, something like 14 times over the course of several decades, to see how the country has changed, to see how the culture has changed, to see very gratifyingly how Latin American students have then gone on to become researchers themselves and to generate their own research programs. So you have rich centers of ecological and evolutionary research now in many Latin American countries. This is something I've been very happy to play a small part in. I remember being terrified in the '74 course by when I was invited to give a talk, just a lecture to the Spanish language course that was meeting nearby in Guanacaste. I think they were at the Guanacaste National Park while we were at Palo Verde, and our TA, Gisela Mora, urged me to give my lecture in Spanish. And I said, "You're out of your mind. I can't do that." And she said, "Oh, yes, you can." And she insisted that I do, and she helped me write out a translation of my talk into Spanish, and which is the first of a couple of times that I've done that. And what an educational experience that was. But also, it was so gratifying to feel as if I could make some slight contribution to the experience that these Latin American students were having, and which would pay off in the future. It has been, for me, the privilege of being associated with OTS, of having these enriching experiences for me, it really has been one of the great privileges of my career. And I thank OTS very much for providing this to me. And I hope OTS will, it is continuing to do just a marvelous job. OTS has made such an enormous difference in our understanding of tropical systems and initiating generations now of researchers who have increased our knowledge and our understanding simply immensely compared to what it was when I started. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to say these too many words. Okay, bye now.